Pamela Chrysler spent her life pulling people back from the edge. As a counselor in mental health and substance abuse, she was a quiet force of compassion, someone who didn't just listen, but truly heard. To those struggling, she offered more than guidance. She offered grace. She was 49 years old and grounded by purpose, a woman devoted to helping others rebuild. But on an ordinary August night in 2002, that life of service ended violently in a crime that would go unsolved for over 15 years. Pamela had recently moved to Athens, Georgia, a college town with southern charm and a youthful buzz. She was house-sitting for a friend, Charles Elam, at the College Place complex, now University Oaks, on Sycamore Drive. Elam had gone to Florida, and Pamela agreed to watch over the apartment while he was away. It seemed like a favor between friends. But by the evening of the 21st of August, that apartment had become a crime scene. Residents first noticed a strange odor. When staff traced the smell to Unit 408 and opened the door with a spare key, they found a gruesome scene inside. Pamela's body lay lifeless on the living room floor. She had been stabbed more than 20 times, brutally, senselessly. She wore only underwear, and her body had been covered with a sheet, a gesture as strange as it was unsettling. The living room was soaked in blood. Yet oddly, only one drop of someone else's blood was found, on a newspaper on the kitchen counter. DNA confirmed it came from a man, but no match was found in any database. There were no signs of forced entry at the front door, but the balcony door was open just slightly. It suggested the killer had entered through it, and perhaps left that way too. The attack had all the signs of a robbery gone wrong. Pamela had no known enemies. She wasn't involved in any dangerous relationships. She had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Elam, when contacted by investigators, told them he had met Pamela recently. They'd gone on a date that didn't develop into anything romantic, but they remained friends. He confirmed that she was staying at his apartment while he was away. Elam admitted to speaking with her daily until she suddenly stopped answering 4 days before her body was found. That worried him, but he assumed she'd just been busy. Detectives were immediately suspicious. Elam had volunteered details no one had released to the public, like Pamela's habit of leaving the balcony door slightly open. Why would he mention that unless he knew something more? He also made a bizarre request to the apartment manager. He asked for the blood-stained carpet to be cut out so he could test it himself. But when pressed, Elam provided solid proof of his whereabouts in Florida. Receipts, eyewitnesses, co-workers. His alibi held. His DNA didn't match the blood at the scene. As strange as his behavior was, he hadn't killed Pamela. The investigation shifted. Detectives dug into Pamela's clients, people struggling with addiction and mental illness, but found no clear suspects. They considered the possibility of a random break-in, especially since the apartment was on the ground floor with an open balcony. Nothing seemed stolen at first glance, until Elam noticed that his vacuum cleaner was missing. At first, this seemed trivial, but when investigators checked local pawn shops, they found the vacuum, sold just days after the murder. There were no cameras, and the clerk only remembered a young man, around 20, dropping it off. Still, it was a lead. Soon after, a neighbor came forward with a chilling memory. On the night of the murder, she had heard noises and peeked through her peephole. She saw a young man, someone she didn't recognize, wheeling a vacuum out of Elam's apartment. Just as she considered opening her door, something stopped her. She cracked open a soda can, and the sound startled the man. He turned and stared at her door before quickly vanishing. It was a close call and a narrowly avoided second tragedy. Using her memory, police created a composite sketch. It was a close match to the pawn shop employee's description. The sketch was shared publicly, but no one came forward. Tips dried up. The case went cold. For years, Pamela's story faded into the background, a silent tragedy buried under newer headlines. Her name became an unanswered question. But the answer had been waiting all along, frozen in a single drop of blood. In 2017, a man named Abdus Salam LaRoche was arrested for selling bootleg DVDs in Metro Atlanta, a minor crime. As part of the case, he had to submit a DNA sample. That unremarkable moment unraveled a mystery that had haunted Athens for over a decade. LaRoche's DNA was a match to the blood found on the newspaper in Elam's apartment. It was definitive. Police moved swiftly. On May 8, 2018, They arrested LaRoche, then 34 years old. He didn't resist. Soon after, LaRoche began to talk. Years earlier, while living in California, he had confided in someone close to him. He admitted to stabbing a woman in Georgia. He had broken into an apartment to steal money, not expecting anyone to be home. But Pamela had been there. She had woken up. She had seen him. So he killed her. Whether out of panic or cold calculation, LaRoche stabbed her over and over, ensuring silence. But he underestimated science. Pamela's body couldn't speak, but her blood held the truth, and it waited patiently until justice caught up. Initially, LaRoche was charged with malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and burglary. But in January 2020, he accepted a plea deal. The most severe charges were dropped in exchange for a guilty plea to voluntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 40 years, 20 in prison, 20 on probation. To some, that wasn't enough. Pamela's murder had been cruel, unnecessary. But for her loved ones, imperfect justice was better than none. Her name could now be spoken not as a mystery, but as a memory honored. Her story was featured on the Case with Paula Zahn in an episode titled, Don't Open the Door. It reminded the world who she was, a healer, a listener, a woman who made others whole. Pamela Chrysler didn't live to see justice served, but her death did not disappear into silence. One drop of blood, one fluke arrest, one database match. It was enough to finally close the case. In the quiet woods near County Road 474 in Claremont, Florida, a man searching for scrap lumber made a grim discovery on the 25th of September, 1988. Amid the brush and solitude lay the mummified remains of a person, wrapped in silence and questions. She wore a bluish-green tank top and an acid-washed denim skirt. Her pantyhose were partially removed. There were no personal belongings, no ID, no sign of who she was. Only her body, long at rest and long ignored. For decades, the world knew her only as Julie Doe. But that was never her name. She was Pamela Lee Walton, a woman whose life, identity, and dignity were taken long before her name was ever known. The scene was puzzling from the beginning. The body was too far gone for any clear determination of the cause of death. There were no gunshot wounds, no obvious trauma. But the state of her clothing and the way she was left suggested violence, likely a sexual assault followed by murder. Investigators estimated she had been dead for several weeks. She had extensive cosmetic surgery, including rhinoplasty and breast implants. These details pointed toward a life in transition, a life rarely given full protection or understanding in 1988 America. At the time, authorities believed they were looking at the remains of a cisgender woman. A forensic sketch was released. The case was worked, but without a name, it stalled. No missing person matched the description. No family came forward. No one knew, or at least no one said, they were missing Pamela. She was buried without a name, a silent soul among many cold cases. Decades passed before science and compassion converged in the way Pamela needed. In 2015, forensic reanalysis revealed that the person known as Julie Doe was genetically male, assigned male at birth. This discovery changed everything. It recontextualized her body, her life, and the assumptions made in her death. Julie Doe was likely a transgender woman. This information wasn't just scientific, it was personal. She hadn't just been misidentified in death. She had likely been erased in life. In a world still grappling with acceptance and inclusion, Pamela's case became a symbol of how the lives of trans people are often hidden, unclaimed, or disregarded, even in death. Her name was still unknown, but now the lens had shifted. The case drew new attention. Organizations like the Trans Doe Task Force and the DNA Doe Project took it up, determined to give her the name she was born with, or the name she chose. Even with the power of DNA and genealogical databases, Pamela's identification wasn't easy. She had been adopted, which meant traditional family tree tracing hit dead ends. Her records were tangled, and her life was one of transition geographically, socially, and biologically. There were no public clues, no digital breadcrumbs, just partial DNA and a community that refused to forget her. For nearly 6 years, the DNA Doe Project worked the case. Volunteers and genealogists poured through records, built out complex family trees, and searched for someone, anyone, who could be related to Julie Doe. On the 10th of March, 2025, the long-standing mystery was finally resolved when the remains were officially identified as those of Pamela Lee Walton. Pamela was born on May 13, 1963, in the state of Kentucky. Assigned male at birth, she was put up for adoption at the age of 5. After being adopted, her name was legally changed to Lee Allen Walton. As an adult, Lee transitioned and began living as Pamela Lee Walton. She identified as a transgender woman. Pamela's early life and background were marked by numerous challenges, particularly those linked to her gender identity. She experienced ridicule and exclusion, including derogatory references made in her high school yearbooks. A particularly haunting detail from her past included a pre-carved headstone that still bore her former name, symbolizing both a rejection of her chosen identity and a painful reminder of the discrimination she endured. In the mid-1980s, Pamela became estranged from her adoptive family following a dispute involving a theft from a family member. This falling out appeared to deepen the divide between her and the people who had once taken her in. Around the 6th of July, 1988, Pamela was arrested in Lexington, Kentucky, on a single charge of prostitution. While the solicitation portion of the charge was eventually dropped, the arrest stands as one of the last verified moments in her known timeline. Following her arrest, Pamela vanished without a trace. No one heard from her again, and despite time passing, her whereabouts remained unknown. Despite confirming her identity, many questions remain unanswered. It is still unknown how Pamela came to be in the area of Florida, where her body was discovered. Furthermore, her exact cause and manner of demise remain undetermined. The Lake County Sheriff's Office has stated that efforts are ongoing to gather more information about the circumstances that led to Pamela's demise, as the investigators continue seeking answers to complete the story of her life and final days. Pamela was someone who fought to exist in a time and place where existence like hers was questioned, punished, or ignored, and she died in silence, like too many trans women before and after her. No one reported her missing, or if they did, the report didn't make it to the right place, or it wasn't believed. The world let her slip away. In 2025, the Lake County Sheriff's Office officially confirmed Pamela Lee Walton's identity. Her remains were no longer anonymous. Her death certificate could finally carry her name. Her grave, if she has one, can be marked properly. And the case, while still unsolved, has found its first thread of justice: recognition. The investigation remains open. Now that they know who she was, investigators hope someone will come forward. Maybe someone remembers seeing her in the 1980s. Maybe someone knows who she trusted. Maybe someone knows who took her life and left her in the woods like garbage. Maybe. The Trans Doe Task Force continues to amplify her story. Her identity is now part of a national conversation about how trans people are remembered, honored, and protected. Her life matters, not just because she was murdered, but because she lived. Pamela Lee Walton spent 36 years buried under the wrong name, not because she wanted it that way, but because the world didn't look hard enough, because the systems designed to protect her didn't. But today, we say her name: Pamela Lee Walton. She was the kind of woman who wore strength like a second skin. Margaret Lois Bill, born in 1951, was a mother, a neighbor, and a cherished soul in the Evans Crossroads community near Rowland, North Carolina. At 45, she lived alone, her children grown and building lives of their own. Her days were simple and steady, defined by the quiet rhythm of rural life and the familiarity of her small neighborhood. But in December 1996, everything changed. On the morning of the 4th of December, 1996, the stillness of Evans Crossroads was pierced by something grim. A neighbor, concerned after not seeing Margaret, entered her home on Tom M. Road and discovered her lifeless body. It was a sight that would haunt the community for decades. Margaret had been brutally stabbed multiple times. The attack was violent, personal, and unprovoked. It left the house soaked in silence and sorrow. Police arrived swiftly. Investigators scoured the scene for signs of forced entry or a struggle, any piece of evidence that could shed light on what had transpired. The brutal nature of the attack made it clear this wasn't random. Someone had meant to end her life. But who? And why? Despite the urgency in those early days, the trail grew cold. There were no eyewitnesses, no immediate suspects, and nothing stolen. Her family, especially her son, Eric Dial, struggled to understand how anyone could do something so horrific to a woman who had lived with such quiet dignity. The community mourned, the case stalled, and Margaret's name was slowly folded into the list of North Carolina's cold cases, unsolved but not forgotten. For nearly 3 decades, her children carried that pain with them like an invisible weight. Every holiday, every birthday, every day without answers added another layer to their grief. The silence that followed her death was almost as devastating as the crime itself. But Margaret's story did not stay buried. In 2019, the Robeson County Sheriff's Office launched a cold case team composed of seasoned, retired investigators who brought with them a renewed hunger for justice. They reopened Margaret's file, pulled out old evidence, and started re-examining the case with modern eyes. A breakthrough came in April 2021 when investigators executed a search warrant and obtained a DNA sample from a man named Kenneth Delton Locklear. The decision wasn't random. It followed a meticulous review of old leads, one of which had placed Locklear on the edges of suspicion back in 1996. Locklear wasn't a stranger. He was Margaret's former son-in-law. At the time of her death, he had been loosely associated with the family, but nothing had definitively linked him to the crime. Now, with new forensic technology at their disposal, investigators submitted preserved evidence for reanalysis. In February 2025, nearly 28 years after the crime, a match was confirmed. Locklear was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The announcement sent shockwaves through Margaret's family and the entire Evans Crossroads community. It brought long-awaited closure, but it also raised painful questions. How could someone once welcomed into the family circle be the one responsible for such a cruel act? At a press conference held by the Robeson County Sheriff's Office, Alice Bell stood before reporters with a calm dignity, acknowledging the sorrow but also the relief. Margaret Lois Bell's story does not end with tragedy, she said. It ends with justice, and today we take one step closer to that reality. Sheriff Bernice Wilkins, whose leadership had revitalized many long-dormant cases in the region, spoke solemnly. As technology and science continue to evolve, cases such as this have a better chance of being solved. This arrest should serve as a message to those who've evaded accountability. We are not giving up. There was a bittersweet undertone to his words. Margaret's mother and several siblings had passed away just 2 weeks prior to the arrest. Sheriff Wilkins shared his regret. What I really wish is that we could have made this announcement before her passing. She deserved to see justice for her daughter. For Margaret's son, Eric Dial, the arrest brought more than relief. It brought release. Out of 28 years waiting, just searching, he said, his voice trembling. But it has been a burden off our hearts. Right now, she is in heaven. She is in heaven rejoicing. But the story didn't end there. On the 18th of April, 2025, just 2 months after his arrest, it was announced that Kenneth Delton Locklear had died while in jail. The cause of his death has not yet been confirmed, and authorities are investigating. For many, his passing raised additional emotions, relief, perhaps, but also frustration that he never stood full trial, never answered publicly for what he had done. Margaret Lois Bell's murder was more than just a crime. It was a decades-long wound carved into the hearts of her children, her community, and everyone who loved her. But through persistence, through science, and through the unshakable belief that her life mattered, justice finally found its way back. Today, Margaret is remembered not just for how her life ended, but for who she was. A warm soul in a small town, a mother who raised her children with love, a woman whose memory refused to be silenced. And now, after nearly 30 years of sorrow and shadows, the silence has finally broken. In March 1990 in Ozark, Alabama, a 22-year-old woman disappeared without warning. leaving behind a young daughter and a deeply concerned community. Tracy Harris, young, shy, and deeply loved, vanished without a word. For someone as dependable and consistent as Tracy, disappearing into thin air was far from normal. There was no note, no packed bags, no hint of intent. Her absence sent ripples through the small southern town and launched a mystery that would take decades to unravel. Tracy had last been seen on the 7th of March, 1990. She was still living in the same house with her ex-husband Carl Harris and their young daughter, Carolyn. Though the romantic bond between Tracy and Carl had dissolved, their shared responsibilities had kept them living under the same roof. A decision that may have stemmed from limited financial options or maternal concern for her child. But those close to her knew the situation was fraught. The home was a pressure cooker, simmering with unresolved tension, whispered stories of violence, and escalating danger. Carl Harris was the one who reported Tracy missing, launching a formal police investigation. As the authorities pieced together the final hour she was seen alive, suspicion began to form a shape. Carl and Tracy's history wasn't unknown. There had been arguments. There had been fear. Though no formal abuse reports existed on paper, those who had stayed in the house during that time, like Dawn Beasley and her fiancé, painted a troubling picture. The household, they said, was filled with tension. Carl had a temper, and more than once, they'd witnessed his anger flare toward Tracy. On the 14th of March, a week after Tracy's disappearance, the search came to a tragic end. Her body was found in the Choctawhatchee River in Dale County. It was a devastating moment for her family and the town that had held on to hope. The autopsy revealed a chilling truth. Tracy had both water and sand in her lungs, confirming she drowned. But bruises and deep markings around her neck suggested she had been strangled. There was more. She was found naked from the waist up, her clothes recovered at a separate location. Though the discovery raised the possibility of sexual assault, forensic evidence couldn't confirm it. The investigation shifted into high gear, and it didn't take long for the police to zero in on Carl Harris. He had motive. He had opportunity. More than a dozen individuals came forward, some testifying to Carl's violent behavior toward Tracy. And as the last person known to see her alive, he sat in the center of suspicion. Further scrutiny revealed that Carl had been involved with another woman during the time he still lived with Tracy. The affair, some speculated, could have served as fuel for eliminating an obstacle. Still, despite the testimonies and circumstantial clues, there was a missing piece. No physical evidence tied Carl to the crime. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing conclusive. So the case stalled. Cold. Tracy Harris was buried, but the questions surrounding her death were not. For more than 2 decades, the case remained open in name only. It lingered in the minds of family members, quietly archived among dozens of unsolved files in Ozark's police department. But everything changed in 2015, when the department formed a cold case unit aimed at re-examining long-dormant crimes. Tracy's name resurfaced, and this time, investigators approached her case with new eyes and a renewed sense of urgency. They reviewed old interviews. They followed the paper trail that had long been forgotten. They spoke to witnesses who hadn't been contacted in years. In September 2016, Carl Harris was arrested for the murder of his ex-wife. After 26 years of freedom, he found himself behind bars, accused of the very crime that had haunted him since 1990. The prosecution built its case carefully, relying on the long history of abuse claims and the absence of any other credible suspects. It wasn't airtight, but it was enough to bring Carl to trial. His world shrank once again to the 4 corners of a courtroom. The weight of nearly 3 decades rested on his shoulders. But just before the trial was set to begin, something extraordinary happened. Dawn Beasley, the woman who had once stayed with the Harris family and witnessed the tension firsthand, came forward with a revelation that no one saw coming. She told prosecutors she couldn't testify, not because she didn't remember, but because the story everyone believed was wrong. Dawn revealed a secret she had carried in silence for 30 years. According to Dawn, shortly after Tracy's death in 1990, a man named Jeffrey Beasley, her then husband, confessed to her that he had killed Tracy. He didn't whisper it under duress or during a fight. He told her plainly, admitting he strangled Tracy and disposed of her body in the river. He said it was an accident, that he panicked, that he feared no one would believe the truth. Dawn kept quiet, out of fear, out of shame, and perhaps out of the misguided belief that the truth would never come back to demand its due. But when Carl Harris was arrested, when she saw an innocent man preparing to go on trial for a murder he didn't commit, Dawn knew she had to speak. Her conscience wouldn't let her stay silent anymore. Her statement flipped the case on its head. The prosecution, faced with a direct confession and the recanting of a star witness, had no choice. Charges against Carl Harris were dropped. He walked free just as the trial was set to begin. Carolyn Harris was just 4 years old when her mother was taken from her. For most of her life, she believed her father was responsible. "I knew my mom's life was ended," she later said. "And then as the years went on, I found out that it had to do with my dad. She had no memories of her mother, only stories passed down from family, tales of a sweet and shy young woman who loved deeply and smiled often." Carl's exoneration left Carolyn wrestling with a lifetime of misunderstood pain. The man she had believed capable of murder was now free, and the man who truly took her mother away was finally in the crosshairs of justice. In January 2020, Jeffrey Beasley, then 54 years old, was arrested and formally charged with Tracy's murder. He pleaded guilty. The courtroom, filled with echoes from the past, heard the final admission. Beasley was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The confession closed the case, but it did not undo the damage. For 3 decades, Carl Harris had lived under a cloud of suspicion. Tracy's family had mourned without clarity, and a daughter had grown up believing a lie. The justice system had almost failed them all, until one woman's voice cracked the silence that had swallowed the truth. The Tracy Harris case is more than a cold case solved. It's a story of trauma buried and finally unearthed. It's about how secrets, no matter how long they hide, never stay buried forever. It's about fear, courage, and the high cost of silence. For Tracy, justice came late. For Carl, redemption came in the final hour. And for Carolyn, the truth, however painful, finally surfaced.